HearMe Out. My name is Watkins. I'm the head of community. JC, if you would be so lovely to unmute yourself and introduce yourself a little bit.
Hello, everyone. I am JayCee Cooper, aka JayCee Lives. The music that you were listening to just a moment ago was one of my edits that I use for DJing here in the Twin Cities in the Upper Midwest. And besides being a DJ, I'm also a two-time national champion powerlifter and curler, and four-time state champion, amongst many other things. I have my hands in a lot of different pots, but I'm also involved in trans advocacy, specifically trans athletes in sports. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk a little bit more about my experiences in community and to just share this space with you.
I love that. JC, did you share your pronouns?
My pronouns are she and they. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm just going to dive in because these conversations are always lovely, but like I would love to get to the deep parts that are sticky and really can hopefully inspire others to lead with more empathy and compassion. So you kind of gave us like some broad strokes, right, about yourself. But for those who don't know you, outside of like the athletic space, what does your identity mean underneath the LGBTQIA plus umbrella?
Sure. So the way that I identify is I'm a queer trans feminine person. And what that means for me is always being redefined, because queerness for me goes beyond a label. It's a very intentional, political, and it's always looking at itself and reinventing itself, and looking at the ways that we can be creative with how we move in our society. And so I use the words queer and trans feminine as a way to like communicate more broadly, but it means different things depending on different moments. So that's kind of how I identify within like the LGBTQIA sphere. I think that I contain many other identification labels, if you want to say that. One of those is I'm also a CODA, so a child of a deaf adult, and I am neurodivergent, and I'm a friend. I'm a daughter, a sister, and a neighbor. And these things all matter to how we navigate life. So that's a little bit about how I identify.
I love that. Like, you're one of my favorite humans on the planet. So I'm so grateful for the strength space, to which we originally connected, because it's one of those opportunities where I can expand and kind of, it takes a person who's kind of like someone you see on Instagram, or you see their activism, it's like at a distance, right? And then it also adds like another layer of the human element, when you can kind of be in person. So in a perfect world, it'd be great that we could do this, like in a live setting, but the pandemic is just doing what she wants to do. So, underneath that sphere, right? So the parts that are really important, because, we're a peer-to-peer support app, and me as the head of community, I really think about creating inclusive spaces and things like that. So how would you define community?
I think community to me, in a more like personal approach, community to me has always been another word for family. And you have varying different like associations with family, right? You might have distant family that you don't keep in touch with. You might have family that you disagree with and you just don't want anything to do with. And you have family that are your close people and who you rely on and support and come together with in a very intimate way. So I think like for me, and I think that this is something that's brought up a lot in queer community, is that idea of like chosen family and family. So that's kind of how I relate. That's how I look at community. Um, and sometimes families and communities can be dysfunctional, and there can be issues that keep people from being able to engage as their full self, or there's barriers to being able to access that community. So I think that, I don't know, that's kind of how I frame it anyway.
Perfect. Because I feel like, within my own queer identity, right? I'm like, oh, chosen family. Like, I feel like I'm closer to my chosen family, than I am more so to my, biological family. And that can be partly proximity, but just also the common understanding. And so, within that, right, I feel like in terms of activism, where we've come,
Mm,
we also talk about like the T as, the LGBT now has become a lot more inclusive and expansive, right? But how, like, where do you think you fit within your identity within the larger framework of like that community space? Because like the title of this, of your topic is like when community is
mhm.
at arm's length, right? And so, what does that mean in context?
Sure. That's one of the things that I've struggled with as a trans athlete, who is also a CODA, who also is neurodivergent, is like exactly that. Like, how do I engage in these spaces and feel like I belong? Because you're it isn't every day that you're gonna have like a CODA, neurodivergent, trans woman sports meetup. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's having those different intersections at play. Like it's not very common. And on top of that too, class, because um I guess I'll just go into like
Yeah.
a story really quick. In 2018, I was banned from being able to compete in powerlifting, and as a result, I spoke out about it, um, because it was unjust and wasn't based on any information at the time. It was simply because I was a trans woman, and uh, a lot of community rallied behind that and stood up for me. But then at the outset, I wasn't able to access that community because at the time I couldn't afford to go to the gyms that people were going that people were at. And so a lot of these people that were supporting me in that moment, I wasn't even able to like be in community with, because I wasn't able to like access the resources and the facilities that they were in. Um, and the same goes for my experience as a child being CODA. My parents were very conservative Christian parents, um, and as a result of that, I always felt like I was being persecuted for being who I was. And so there's that intersection at play of like religion and my CODA identity, and a parent being deaf, um, and parent style, where I wasn't, I wouldn't consider myself 100% fluent in sign language. And so I didn't feel like I was fitting, like I could fit into the CODA community, nor the church community that I was in. And, because of the way that my family communicated amongst one another, it made it difficult for me to fit in with my hearing like classmates. And so there was just a lot of feeling on the outside looking in. And um, even when people did extend a hand, it was almost as if it was just out of reach, you know. Um, And that's a theme that I see coming up in my life, um, cyclically. Um, that doesn't mean that I am not coming into community with people. That is for sure. But um, it's just some of my experiences in coming to community with folks.
Yeah, I think that's real. I feel like, a lot of times we tend to take people as like singular entities, right? We identify, latch onto one thing, and then we see them really just as that one thing, and we forget about the complexities that make up people, right? And so, as you're talking, for me, I think about, when people are like, well, slavery was over X years ago, right? Or like, you're free now, or everything, or all these things have changed. And you're like, I hear what you're saying, but there's like a level of access, right? That like, you're like, okay, I hear you, but I'm just so close, but we still have like that work to do. And so taking those things into consideration, right? Like, I can never understand the experience completely, of you learning to love, and accept yourself, right, through all of those things. And so, I'm curious, with everything you just mentioned and the journey, to getting to like self love and where you're at, if you choose to share, how does this impact, even from your point of view, like mental and emotional well being?
Ah, so much. I mean, I think that it's taken a very long time to get to the place where I'm actually taking care of myself, and seeing the value in that. Because I was on the outside so often, it makes you feel like you don't matter and you don't belong and you're not a valued individual. And I think that with the help of therapy, um, I've I've been able to get to a point where I see what I bring into a space and the contributions that I do make. And we're talking about, I am a person who has won 2 national championships, and this is how I'm feeling. And so, like, um, I think that's important to note because you could look at someone at face value and be like, oh wow, look at all the things that they're doing. They must be so loved, and whatever, but you really don't know um the experiences of someone until you really sit down and get to talk to them. And um yeah, I guess I kind of diverted from your original question. What was the original
It's
question?
fine. It's fine. Those are the parts that are really important, right? Because regardless of my question, what really echoes for me, right, is that you can be doing all these things. And just so we're clear, like JC stays collecting snatching trophies, collecting medals, and living the best life, with respect to the sport in a lot of ways. And also, in terms of like support and, really being understood is also like still that challenge, right? And really being embraced. And so you touched on something earlier that I want to circle back to, right? Which is, you know, um, what are some of the misconceptions that people have about trans athletes? That's just blanket.
Sure. I think that when people look at trans athletes at face value, people aren't taking in the context of like where people are. Um, there is a lot of rhetoric, especially right now, that would suggest that, trans women are men trying to take over sports. And the reality is that's not the case at all. Um, there hasn't been a single instance of a cis man trying to deceive anyone into thinking they were a woman for access to sports that are already underfunded and don't get the support that they deserve. The flack that you get um, from being a trans athlete, no one would intentionally put themselves in a position to be treated like that. Um, and also, we often don't consider the wide biological differences that are in people. And so to say that, to compare trans women to men, and first of all, is a framework of trans misogyny, because we simply aren't men, and that's just a basic fact. And um, in addition to that, um, the the idea that all men are better than women in every aspect of sport is the definition of misogyny. So I think, like, when people try to frame arguments to exclude trans women from sport, they don't realize that they are literally punching themselves in the face and and saying, not only do we not want trans women in the sports, but we also believe that we are inferior. And that's simply not the case. There's so many different factors at play, that aren't considered, and context that just isn't considered. And that's just like one like perspective, right? There are, a plethora of different perspectives that could be looked at, whether or not that has to do with like hormone therapies, or has to do, with perspective on, what is gender and what is sex. um, so I think it's a lot more complex than just comparing, trans women or trans men to cis men and cis women, um, or trying to um, take like fairly complex um, ideas and forcing them into simple boxes in order to like come to a flawed understanding. There's just so much more that needs to be considered. And what we're seeing right now is an attack on our community that is based on that flawed understanding. And so I think that that's one of the big things that I would want people to know, is that, that people who don't want trans women to compete in sports, and the people who are pushing these bills in state legislatures and whatnot, it has never been about sports, and it's becoming more and more evident as that pivot to other areas of life for trans people are coming up. So it started with transports. Now we're talking about bathrooms again, and now we're talking about taking away healthcare. There are conversations now talking about whether or not trans people should even exist. It was never about sports. It was about disagreeing with our fundamental place on this world, in this world. So I don't know. I think that that's, understanding that context is really, really important.
100%, because like, yes, we right now are like in this moment talking about sports, but from where I sit, like, I'm watching this active erasure of really core important identities
Yeah.
that have kind of led the forefront of moving like the world forward, right? I feel like um a lot of the activism and things that have gotten better, have been led by trans women, or non-binary people. So like, I'm thinking a lot about like, what impact do you think things like Don't Say Gay, anti-trans legislature, and like just constant active erasure, right, of members from the LGBTQIA plus like sphere have like on a person? Because I imagine like you spend a lot of time just kind of trying to be okay with your identity. You spend a lot of time like getting to a place of self-love. You spend a lot of time trying to be what is not represented, and now you're done a lot of that work to watch someone go, nope, sorry, we no soup for you.
Right.
Like,
I
what role
know.
does that play on
I
mental health?
mean, there's, I think for a lot of people, what I'm noticing is fear and isolation. I think that the way that things are being framed, it makes it feel like you are alone, even when that's not the case at all. There's so many people feeling that same emotion. Um, and so, yeah, I think fear is a big driver. We're at what, 18 states that have now banned trans youth being able to play in youth sports. We're not talking about like Olympic level athletes. We're talking about kids. Um, and that being the first target, right? So of course that's gonna instill some fear. Like being a kid, being told that they can't be themselves and participate in school sports. I mean, that's like a basic function, like a basic thing that many kids get to experience, and you're taking that away. And that's immediately puts you on the outside of your school community. So um, I think that bills like this function to isolate people and to make them feel like we aren't uh, that we aren't a part of culture and that we aren't a part of the larger community and that we don't relate. They don't want us to have conversations like we're having today, because that's when we figure out that we aren't alone in this, and that and we discover that community does exist, um and that we need to be talking about these things and coming together and speaking out together, you know.
Yeah, I feel like so like it's a perfect tie because on the one end, right, we're talking about this sense of isolation, which we can very clearly see happening,
Hmm.
right? But then in terms of activism and growth, we see very clearly, like the lesbian, gay, in the larger sphere seems to really get to move forward, right? But like somehow trans and non-binary other identities kind of still fall to the back.
Yes.
So what can we do, right, to kind of make the hands meet? Sanitize hands, just kidding. But like, how, because it's a pandemic. But like, for real though, like, how do we bridge that gap? Like, how can not only just allies be better, but how can it, from your perspective, the sphere be better in supporting, trans non-binary folk?
Mm. I think um starting from a conversational place is always really important. Like we said earlier, you don't really know what's going on in someone's life from at face value, right? um and developing those relationships takes time, and you need to be able to listen and engage in that listening, right? So like stay engaged in that listening, um and ask the questions that need to be asked, like, you know, uh, to get to know someone better and to know where they're at, right? Um, and also realize that, people coming from different cultural backgrounds and ideology and things like that, you're going to make mistakes. However, if you're coming from an empathetic place, a sympathetic place, and you're there to help, more often than not, it's okay to like make a mistake, apologize, move
Move on.
through it. And in the end, you might have a stronger relationship because of that. So I think starting these conversations and coming together in community and being patient and understanding, um, and really doing your research and like seeing like what people are going through right now, because the reality is that it's a very difficult time for the trans and non-binary community. um like we said, we're looking at all these bills and legislation, and rhetoric being in the public sphere, like that is scary and isolating. So yeah, I think that as like a starting place is very essential.
Yeah, I like was listening and thinking of so many different ways to go, but this is the part that I think is also just really like I want to shift to, because my first part is, what are some of the challenges, and you can speak to your own experience, that you face living your life out loud. Like,
Mm,
what are some of the reasons why some other people may not be able to live as freely? Because I recognize in my own sphere, it just may not always be safe to come out of the closet or let people in. But I feel like there's an added layer, right, when you're of like trans and non-binary experience.
mm, yeah. How do I even want to address this? Because it's like
This is
so
honest. So
many different experiences that should have made me quiet and should have made me isolate. and
it's not who you are.
um and I've refused to, Um that said, um I guess I'll bring up this as an example. When I started speaking out as a trans athlete, um conservative and right-wing media like really grasped onto that. And it got to a point where I was getting thousands of hate messages um and people like releasing like my address and personal information for not just me but like ex-partners and um and things like that. So it's like sometimes you're right. It's like to speak out really puts a target on your back. So it's like it's something that like you have to consider and calculate carefully as a trans person in like an advocacy space or in sport or anything like that, is like how public do you want to go with this and how much do you want to put yourself out there, and it's always having to calculate that risk, right? um so exactly, like it is in every decision that we make, you know in life, and there's not a moment that of respite when it comes to um speaking up about these things, if that makes sense. I don't know.
No, I mean, it does, because I feel like this is where I want to shift to like really having an authentic conversation around safety, right? Because the media does what the media does. And, dead naming, those types of things happen. But like, we understand, you and I both understand, and maybe everybody, here that's listening understands that, fatal violence disproportionately affects transgender women of color, particularly Black transgender women.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, we look at that at the intersection of race, sexism, homophobia, all those things, right? And of course, like this unchecked access as well, right, to guns and so on.
Mm,
Then we think about the intersection, as you said, access. So we're talking about employment, where
mm,
most, there's a lot of individuals who have to turn to sex work, right?
mm.
Instead of being able to have maybe the jobs that they want.
Right.
Housing being in question, right? Healthcare, which we're talking about, is essentially being erased, and like other necessities. So, from your point of view, what are clear ways that each of us, that's me, everybody on here, anybody who listens, can dismantle a culture of violence, that so that we can create safer spaces for transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary people?
I think yes. There is a video of let's see, Miss Major talking about um it was on Trans Day of Visibility, and she was talking about how the trans community doesn't need to be more visible. We are already visible as it is. Who needs to be visible are our friends and family who love us and the people who are around us, who often stay invisible when we need their visibility. And so like having them say, you know, I love a trans person out loud and being public about it, and having them, you know, be on the front line, that way we aren't putting people at risk. It's That's always stuck with me, because it's so true. Like trans people have been visible and have been driving movements since the 60s. And it's like beyond time that our colleagues, friends, and allies come to the front and love on us publicly and take some of that work and some of that burden. And with the help of trans people, of course, we don't want to erase people in the process, but we want people to speak out, not be afraid to say trans in the public sphere. Like as politicians, not being afraid to stand up for us and hiding us within an acronym.
Whew.
Actually speaking to the actual issues at hand and who are the most impacted. Like, when's the last time that, you know, someone in the public sphere has said Black trans women are experiencing disproportionate amounts of violence, and it's been increasing year after year? It's like, I don't need to say that. I mean, I do, but it's not trans people who need to say that. We've been saying that for years on years.
I mean, there were no lies told whatsoever. And I absolutely agree with you, right? I feel like so many times the labor is on the oppressed, right? Or the labor is on those who are the most marginalized to advance everybody else forward. And so for me, I always make that connection, you know, as you said, don't be afraid to make a mistake, right? Because I feel like, and correct me, let me know how you feel about this. I feel like people's inaction when they witness harm, um, sometimes for me does more damage um, than someone actually moving forward, getting involved, or failing to even attempt to affirm my identity, right? And I don't know if the same thing is true for you, but I'm curious. What do you think?
I mean, absolutely. I think, and I think that is something that holds people back from getting involved. Like they don't necessarily want to experience any backlash if they make a mistake. And it's like, believe me, when someone does want to correct you or, you know, talk about these things, they're doing it out of care, and they're doing it because of something that's deeply hurtful within their life, right? And so you shouldn't be afraid of experiencing that, because it just makes you a better person in the end. And for that to stop you, you know, I mean, how do we break the cycle of harm if there aren't going to be people willing to break those chains, you know?
Yeah.
um and so yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like as a trans person, I'm always trying to become ever mindful of where people are at and meeting people where they're at. Not that it's always my responsibility, um but I want people to come on board, and I want us all to be able to come into community and learn together, and um support one another in a way where we truly are there for one another, if that makes sense.
No, yes, it absolutely does. And it makes me wonder, right? So you talked a little bit about, you know, like the kind of nuances of what role therapy has played in your life. But I'm
Mm.
also curious about what role like peer support or like other people outside of the therapeutic sphere have played in your life? Like, what was helpful, what was not, if you can speak to that?
Sure. I guess in kind of like putting the therapy and peer support thing both together. Um, Therapy hasn't always been beneficial because I haven't always had access to affirming therapists to begin with. And I think that that's where peer support became like played such a huge role, is like when experiencing practitioners who didn't affirm my identity or didn't understand. Like it was my friends that I went um, to try to talk this stuff out and to process it. And, um, so I think having having friends who have shared identities with you is of utmost importance because they share some of those same experiences, and you can talk through those things like, oh yeah, don't go to that person, that person is a noted like anti-trans like practitioner or whatever. And that's part of the importance of community, is to be able to relay that information and communicate those things. That way we're protecting one another. um and that's why I hold elders within my community in such high regard, is that they have vast full, or just like stores of knowledge that we don't have about experiences throughout many many years, right? And how do we learn without like looking at our histories and the communication and stories that comes along with it, right? So I think therapy in and of itself isn't enough. You have to be able to have that peer support, because not every therapist is going to have it figured out. you know um and that can only bring you so far. And I think I'm fortunate that I came to that conclusion and advocated for myself in a therapy space, um and was able to find people that were affirming um and had experience in working with trans folks. But that isn't always the case, and
Right.
that's why community is so important.
Yeah, I feel like something I kind of want to stick to because right, we're text based. We don't get to have face conversations. So most of us are talking to a stranger. We've across the globe. We have no idea, right? We're anonymous. And what resonates with me is the idea of affirmation.
Yep.
And it breaks my heart to hear, right, that like here you are, access is already, it's a challenge because some of the free or low cost services aren't giving what they need to give.
Yep.
And here you are, actually, okay, I'm going on a limb here, I'm getting the therapy I need, and you get there and you're not affirmed.
Yep.
So can you speak to us about what affirmation looks like in support of you growing in your identity, whether that's for you or things that are common?
Right. I think that when folks are coming into a space where they're looking for support and for help, they're not looking for folks to be contrary. um and I think that sometimes I'm trying to like word this like carefully, but like I think sometimes that people, in an effort to better understand folks, um will use language and trying to get that clarification that feels contrary. Like, for instance, someone uses the singular they pronoun, and asking for clarification, like, oh, are there multiple people with you? You know, like asking for that clarification can often be disempowering and invalidating to the person that you're talking to. And so I think like really being mindful about language and about how you get that clarification, like those clarifications, and building that into your interactions. Like a good example, you asked me earlier, hey, like, what are your pronouns? And you introduced yourself with your pronouns. Like, that's one way. And I don't want to make this about pronouns because that's talked about a lot, but like that's just one example about affirmation. So like, yeah, when people are coming into a space and they really need support, like making sure to not come into that space with a I'm trying to get to what I'm trying to say, and I'm having a hard time.
Like a stereotype or definition, or like some preconceived notion.
Yeah, preconceived notions, or just like a contrary nature. Like I feel like that is the thing that I run into the most, is that especially in, I mean, I know it's not a clinical space that you're working with because you're doing text peer support, but especially in clinical spaces, when there's this idea that, oh, I've gone to, 4 years of undergrad, a master's, and a PhD. It's like, and I know more than you about this. There's this level of invalidation that can occur. And I think that like that needs to be avoided in order to affirm someone for where their beliefs and values are.
Right.
So it's kind of like that power dynamic.
Sure.
That needs to be like constantly evaluated.
Love that, because I think about, right, from me being also a fitness instructor, I think about, I have all this information about how to make you achieve whatever fitness goal you have, but at the end of the day, you are the expert on you,
Yeah.
right? And I can only make a recommendation based on what your shared goals are to help you achieve that. So if you are telling me this is who I am, who
Mhm.
am I to then turn around and be like, actually, because of my PhD and my 3 weeks of life coaching, no, you're not, right? So,
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
that's okay. So, okay, I think we're same page. We are clicking.
Mhm.
So this is the point too, where if anybody has a question, please feel free to put it in the comments. I will definitely pause to read those over to JayCee. Um, but in that same thread, I feel like one thing I want to change in spaces, especially in, communal spaces. Can you talk about, from your point of view, what impacts does misgendering or greetings in a gender binary form have on TGNC people?
Oh wow, yeah. I mean, that's one of like instant invalidation, right? Um, Many of us have significant traumas, like gender-based traumas and violence in our past. And so misgendering, like it is like a stab to the heart for a moment, and people react differently, obviously, but for some it's a very physical and reaction and invalidation. And it's basically saying that I don't see your true identity right now. Like I might like, and even if you change that, there's always going to be that thought in the back of my mind, oh, this is how they see me, you know um so it's so hard. It's super difficult, and it makes you pause to think about whether or not you belong in that space at all.
I think it's also right, the assumptions of just because what I see does not necessarily reflect exactly who the person is, right? And so
Mhm.
I oftentimes now like get, super frustrated, because I am so used to, hey guys, and I'm like, okay, but it's a room full of women, so I'm really confused, right? And then I'm like, but is it even really a room full of women, or like, when was the last time I was in a space where someone walked into a room presumably full of men and said, hey ladies, like,
Mhm.
maybe like in gay male culture, but like, why are we doing that? So I think we drive the point home, but I'm curious, what is your favorite greeting for communal spaces?
Um, I often revert. I often say y'all. I think
Same.
I think y'all and folks and
Yeah.
it's not just because I like outlaw country either. It's just um no, I think yeah, those are the two that I go to the most are y'all and folks. Hey folks, how's it going?
Right. Because I feel like in an athletic space, I'm always like, hey, athletes, or like, hey, champions, or like whatever. But
Champions,
just,
I like that.
yeah, because at the end of the day, we're all winning at something when we at least show up. Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's me being the coach that I am in a fitness space and wanting to identify, what people are there for and
Mm,
kind of reframing, dismantling the misconceptions that they continually inherit and hold on to and helping them redefine themselves. But that's another conversation because we don't talk about me as a fitness instructor. Um, so as we begin to wrap, finish this statement. Leading with empathy creates.
mm. Harmony.
Say more. That's beautiful. Say more, please.
I think it's easy to finish that off and say community. I think harmony is something it's where two different ideas or things can work together in one approach and can still be beautiful or discordant or you know uh, but still working together towards a shared goal.
I love that. I felt like an immediate sense of calm. Like I felt the harmony, like everything with inside of me. I don't know anybody else, but I was like balance. So that felt really nice. Thank you for that
Yeah.
response. And again, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. But I also, our tagline is be yourself, we'll listen. And so, what can Hear Me do to support you, your activism, your work, and reach back so that you're not just floating out there in the wind,
um
grasping?
I guess follow me on Instagram. JC is alive is my Instagram.
Yes.
um I'm posting about my DJ endeavors and my sports endeavors on there. And that's mainly where I am social media wise. You can find my SoundCloud if you want. JC Lives is my DJ name. uh, and yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. I do try to like respond to like everyone. Not I'm not saying that like um, it's mainly because I try to take breaks from social media. It's not because I'm
Yeah.
super popular. um, but yeah, no, reach out. Come, like I'm happy to be in community with folks. So
I love that. JC, I don't see any questions in the chat, but I do want to say very clearly, boldly, and directly, I love you so much. I am grateful that you made time to show up in this space and to share with us because, as I said in the beginning, these opportunities are rare and they're rare because people don't really reach out for them. And also, I think it takes a lot to trust this space and to share about your experiences, your point of view authentically. So absolutely we'll reach back. Absolutely we'll follow you on the grams. I found the SoundCloud and I'm living my best life. So please keep posting there. And the real piece too is just for everybody, please remember, as JC said, right? Like as trans people, despite, they shouldn't have to solely be being the ones doing the work. There is a lot of hate and a lot of rhetoric that comes on the other side of that activism. And so remember to share a little bit more love, a little bit more empathy, and that sometimes those breaks that happen on social media is because it's self-care, right? And so that's a good model for all of us. So if there's nothing else, y'all, I guess this is it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the comments in the chat. I'm feeling loved right now. So
I love that. All right, y'all, have an amazing rest of your day. Please hold on to this, keep it in the forefront, lead with compassion, and be affirming. All right, have a wonderful day, y'all.
I